Let's go on. So, good morning. Today's lecture is about shape analysis, and this is something we can now start with after we have done everything else throughout the course. And so we have done a lot of things. We have been playing with image enhancement to improve the images, segmentation, also automatic methods for segmentation, identifying some regions of interest, even done some machine learning. Now we want to go to the next step. And now we want to know a little bit more how big, what is the shape of samples, do the different samples have different shapes? Can we compare different images? Can we also check if there is a trend towards some corner of the image, etc. But also what we're going to talk about today is a little bit how to do pretty renderings and also making it possible for finite element simulations. So today we're going to look into object characterization, also in volumes, also looking on to the center of objects and the extents of them. Further on, looking into anisotropy, and there will be further topics, also adding principal component analysis, which is a very great tool for enhancing and pre-analyzing images, preparing it for segmentation. When we start measuring the images, we need some metrics. We have the shape tensor, for example, which describes what the shape is of an object. Principal component analysis I just mentioned. We can also talk about ways to represent any object as an ellipsoid. And further on, different metrics to look into. So coming back to this slide, which I have been showing pretty many times already, but we still have the problem that we produce a lot of data through an experiment, in particular if we do tomography or even time series of tomography. We have until now still not really reduced the amount of data radically. Still, we are working with several gigavoxels of images, even though we only use maybe 1 bit, as would be from the segmentation. But there's still really a huge amount of data. Now we want to reduce it really strongly. And one thing we can do is to identify objects in the image. So what we want to know is to look into volume fractions of some kind of feature in the image. Maybe want to count cells, put quantitative numbers if the cells are stretched or if there are variations in sizes of features. So we want to reduce all these gigavoxels into a little tiny table, which gives us some quantitative numbers. On this topic, there has been written a lot. Of course, we have John Ross' book. He always tells something nice about everything. If you want to go a little bit more into depth, you can look into morphometry. That book is actually based on the language R, but the main ideas are well represented, and it's not so difficult to find the similar things in Python. Then there is a lot of papers around the shape tensors, and also a chapter about the principal component analysis in this book, Modern Applied Statistics in S. S is another one. It's a commercial package, which is similar to R. So, but still, the main things are still transferable into what you can do in Python. For this lecture, we need quite some modules to load. I'm going to show them as we come across them, but right now I'm just opening it up. And the first thing we need to do if we want to quantify information in an image, we have done our segmentation. We have a lot of black and white pixels, but they're still not really identified to what is an item in this image. And that is where component labeling comes in. So what it does is to bunch all pixels together that touch each other, put the same label on them. And then it takes the next bunch of pixels which are bundled together and put another label on them. The problem is with this method, if you have two items that touch each other, then they will be counted as a single object. And that's not really what we wanted. In an upcoming lecture, I will also review, give you some ideas how to get around this problem. So let's just load an example image. This is from a database called Cityscape. On this picture, you can see several cars. And in the database, they also have already prepared the segmented cars. So you can see where the cars are. What you can see here is in the segmented image is that some cars are not fully covered. So for example, this one is covered by this sign. This one is complete. This one has a line across it. And that's because there is probably some kind of street lights coming in the way. And this one I think is covered by trees. So all cars are not really fully marked up. For the moment, we don't care very much. But we will see that there are effects when we start labeling the objects. In Python, there is a nice function in scikit-image called label. And if you look at the help page for that one, you can see that you can do labeling. You can have one connectivity, you can have two connectivity. So that would be across a neighborhood. So you have the four neighbors in the orthogonal directions. The two connectivity is when you fill the whole round with 8 pixels around the pixel. Then you can set a lot of extra parameters to this function, but the main call is just that you say you have an image and you want this kind of neighbors or this kind of connectivity. So let's call this function. I'm doing it here on this line. Oops. You can see here, labeled image is same equal to label and the segmented image. And from this one, we get the white image, we get this nice colored image. And you can see this one is green, orange, but this car is already labeled as 2 pieces. This one is complete, this one is labeled as 3 pieces, and this one is complete again. So you see here that as this algorithm is only looking for connected pixels, it cannot know actually that you have something just 1 pixel away, which actually belongs to it. And this is one of the drawbacks of this algorithm. Let's go on. Hey, I want to go on. So, and now we have a little trick. You saw here now that you had pixels in the image which have new numbers. Each object has an unique number. And what we can do is now to compute the area of the object just by saying, if I count all the pixels with label 1, then I get the area of that pixel. Of course, you need to scale it afterwards with the pixel size, and then you get the real area. And this thing about summing is you do that actually in a very efficient way if you call a histogram, because in this case, the histogram would tell you how many pixels you have of each label. So if you create a histogram that has the same number of bins plus the background as the number of classes, then you get a nice area computation using the histogram. And it's very efficient instead of going a loop over label 1, go through the whole image, label 2, go through the whole image. The histogram actually does the counting for you in one single sweep. So that's a very efficient way of computing the area, or if you have three-dimensional objects, the volume of the objects. So let's look into a simple component labeling algorithm. Here I have created a little image where we have just zeros and ones. And you have these diagonal pins here. And this is what we're going to analyze now. And the first initialization we do is to set every pixel to a new value. So in this case, actually, we are setting the value of the pixel index. So we are going just here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we come to 9, go on, 10, 11, and go on to 17, and so on. In the end, we have 81 pixels in this image. So the last pixel here is label 81. So that's a very simple initialization. And now we start a kind of Brushfire labeling algorithm. So for each pixel that belongs to the foreground, look in its neighborhood and set if the pixel in the neighborhood is also a part of the foreground, then we set the label to the minimum label of the 2 pixels. And then we repeat until no labels are changed anymore. So it needs to iterate a couple of times until you have this algorithm done. Now let's implement this. And you see there is a lot of loops and also a couple of ifs in here. And the loops go first over the image, and then it goes over the neighborhood. And then from that, we can check if there is a label, a pixel in the foreground, and then assign the right label. And then you can see here, over the iterations, it goes on for a while. And iteration 1, there is a lot of changes. Iteration 2, there is less. And iteration 3, there is even less. And in the final iteration, there is nothing to update. So then everything is done and the algorithm converges. This you can see also visualized here, that you have first initialization image. And then in the first step, you can see here that you have one step in. Here is the 1 is propagated to this position. So the 11 turns into 1. This one turns into 11 because this previous one was an 11. So the 11 is propagated inwards. And on this side, you can see that it's going towards 49. The 49 is here. And the 57 is propagated out. And also the 65 is propagated out. Next iteration, we have already 3 pixels put to the same label. And you can see here, it goes out. So it's really like a fire sweeping over the landscape and changing its properties. And it's very quickly converges in this case to complete. But for larger images with more complicated structures, this one is not the most efficient one. And there is a lot of efficient algorithms. Some are even very old, like this one by Rosenfeld and Fals from '66. So already in the 60s, they did image processing and labeled images. Soil, Morphological Image Processing is a great book, by the way. Already on page 38, he describes an algorithm for doing this kind of labeling in the images. And let's do an animation. Now I think this one, sorry, I don't think I ran the whole thing before starting now. So let's run this. So there you see it's actually executes pretty quickly. This one takes a little bit longer time, but here it comes. And now let's do the animation. This one also takes a little time to execute, but now you can see how it animates, how the Brushfire is propagating through the landscape. And you can see in the end, we have labels 1, 9, 49, and 51 in this image. Another thing is if we have a bigger image and actually look into also using different neighborhood. In this case, we have an image here. Everything is labeled only as once as the binary image. Here we do the initialization. And now we want to look at what happens to this image. And again, we need to run the labeling. And it goes pretty quick. Again, similar type of algorithm as before. And now we want to animate these iterations and see what comes out of it. No, I didn't understand this. Okay, that was strange. Then I have to go back. So it's forgot the, so now it's labeled. And this one is also good. And let's go back to the slides. So, and now you can see how this front is propagating through the image and nicely labels it into 2 clear classes. This is still the 8 connected neighborhood as it looks. And let's go on to the next one. And now we have a 5 by 5 neighborhood. Until now, we have only used direct neighbors around the pixel. But what happens if we do a larger neighborhood? So in this case, we're going to 5 pixel neighborhood. So there is a first inner ring and then an outer ring of neighbors. And now if we run this animation, you can see that something else happening. That actually both objects are now labeled as the same. So if you have a larger neighborhood in your labeling algorithm, you can actually cover also gaps like this one, with the risk that you also label other objects to the same label, which you didn't want to. So be careful when you choose the neighborhood. We can also do a smaller kernel. Until now, we had 8 pixel neighborhood. We can also go into a single pixel neighborhood. And same thing again. Now you can see here on this line that the neighborhood is only going in these directions. And run the iterations. And let's see what comes out when we do this Brushfire or visualization. There it goes. So now you can see it again propagates the same way as with 3 by 3, but there is a difference. You can see in these 2 corner pixels, they are not marked up in the right way. So this is the drawback of using a smaller neighborhood. Actually, this corner actually gets the right number, but this one is on the diagonal, and that's why it's actually labeled as a new object. If we compare these different neighborhoods, we have the original 3 by 3 was done within 9 iterations, and we got 2 segments, which is expectable. The 5 by 5 was done within 5 iterations, and this one only got 1 object. The cross iterated a lot more because of the smaller neighborhood, of course, and that one reached 3 objects. So really, depending on how you select the neighborhood, you also get different number of segments and also different number of iterations. It's not only about iterations, actually, because investigating a 5 by 5 neighborhood takes much longer to do than investigating across. So in the end, I believe you would do approximately the same number of comparisons, no matter what kind of neighborhood you use. More or less, there will probably be some small deviations, but for these sizes of neighborhoods that we have here, I think there is not a big difference. So now we have labeled our objects and we want to measure something. So what can we measure? We can actually count the number of voxels of each label and estimate the volume, as I showed with the histogram. We can also see what the changes is during erosion or dilation and estimate the surface area. So if you, for example, have the object and erode and subtract that one, the pixels you get afterwards is actually the surface pixels. The other way it would be also that you do a dilation, and the difference would be kind of the enclosing shell around the object. So what we want to do is counting something like cells, for example. We want to tell something about these objects. And we also want to compare cells or objects from image to image. But how would we start doing this? The first thing we can do is to tell where it is. And for that, we can use the center of volume. For a single object, we can see here is our test labeled car. We have two parts of it because of the street light. And now we want to compute the area or the center of one of these objects. And the object center is computed as the average of all pixels in each direction. So you scan the image and multiply it by the unit vectors in each directions. And then you, from that, you get actually the position in average position of x's in and y's and z's. And this will tell us afterwards where the center of the object is. Here we have coordinates from object 2. I think it's actually all of them. So you have here the coordinates, and you compute the average coordinate of these, and you compute the average coordinate of these. And this will give us the center position, which is calculated to be around here. And it actually makes pretty much sense. Another way to compute is center of mass. So in addition to just the shape of the object, you also add the gray level of each pixel. And then you normalize by the average gray level in the whole object. And that you do the same way. Again, you have the positions and you multiply it by the gray level. And you do that for X, Y, and Z. Computing this on our image, we create a new one actually, where we have some background and we have some gradients within the image. Segmenting the image produces this white box in the middle. And that can be used to compute the center of the object. And if we want to compute the center of mass, we need to use this one too. And during the calculation, you can see that the center of the object, center of the volume, is pretty much in the middle here. However, if you take the center of mass, it moves out towards this corner because this corner is heavier than that corner. And that can be used in some cases for analyzing the object. Further things we can look into is, we have already computed the area. I mentioned the perimeter length or the surface shell. Can also look into sphericity, which is the ratio between the perfect sphere and the object you investigate. You can also look into the orientation of the object if you have everything else than a round object, it can have an orientation, and you can actually tell also this information. And instead of implementing a lot of code to do this, there is already the region props function in Scikit image. And it has a lot of different parameters that it looks into. And if we call the region props on an image, let's see, it's the car image, then it actually calculates all this information for us. So we don't even have to do all these calculations, summings, etc., unless you think it's fun to implement your own algorithm, but also for your understanding. But otherwise, all this is provided through the region props function. So this is a lot of information. Some of it is too abstract. It doesn't even relate to what you want to know, maybe even be too specific. And if you ask yourself in your field, in this case, there is about a biologist, have you ever asked how long is a cell in the x direction? Usually you don't care about the x direction. You want to know how long it is in the longest direction, if at all. And also the same about y. So if you have an object looking something like this, it doesn't help us much to know. Just have to put this one right. It doesn't help us to know what is the distance in this direction, or what is the distance of the object in this direction. What you want to know, if at all, is this direction and that direction. But that's information you also can get in some cases. I think region props actually gives you that one too, major and minor axis. But anyway, a good starting information is still to find the extents of the image. So if you have something like this, you may want to know what are the extents because you want to extract it for some reason. So you want to create smaller images of each of them. Then it's good to know the extents. Looking into this car image, you can look at, we want to find this region box. And that is done by looking at the coordinates, creating a list of coordinates in X and a list of coordinates in Y. And then we just look at the minimum of the X coordinates, the maximum of the X coordinates, and the same for the Y coordinates. And then we get the information that it goes from 4 to 12 in X and 3 to 15 in Y. So we have found the corners of this bounding box. And if we draw them in the figure, we can see nicely that it actually brings in a box around the object. The reason why it's crossing through here is actually that the coordinates are given at the center positions of the pixels. If you want to do a nice drawing, you have to add a little bit to the drawing, but usually this is good enough. So let's look into the region props in real images. We have now labeled our cars and go on. We do shape analysis. We look into each car. We have identified, in this case, thanks to region props, we have the center, we have the bounding box of each car. And from this, we can now start doing some kind of statistics, and we even want to add color as a description of each car. And what we do is we compute the average color within each of these regions, and then we take the closest color to that. So it's we are using a k-neighbors classifier, where we have brought in all the colors and associate them with names. And then you can see that actually it's pretty boring colors, dim gray, silver, dark slate gray. So every car is gray, but it actually also corresponds to what you see out on the streets. So this is the information you can get from with the help of region props. Next thing is looking into anisotropy, which is something, a way to describe an object. And the question is, what is it? According to the dictionary, it's varying magnitude according to the direction of measurement. So that would be, if you again have this, oops, that wasn't meant to. So I got a pen. So if you have, again, this object, you can say that it is much thinner than it is tall. So you can, but you have to put some kind of numbers or names on it. So you can say it's tall or skinny, short or fat, perfectly round. All this can be measured with the help of some kind of anisotropy metric. Some definitions you can do is to compute longest side over shortest side -1, shortest side longest side minus shortest over longest, and so on. You have many variations how you define this anisotropy. In all of these cases, a 0 corresponds to a sphere, which is a good thing to have, that you always come back to the 0 when you have the sphere. But anyway, let's look at what happens if we change our sphere. So let's just create a little bit of function to test them. And then we run a test example where we have a different ratio between the two sides. And what you can see here, you start out with a disk, and then we change it so that it's getting more and more narrow. And the first anisotropy increases radically all the time. The more narrow it gets, the larger the number. Anisotropy 2 seems to be actually converging towards something, and actually all the other ones are slower in the increase. And now it's the question, what actually makes sense for your investigation, what kind of anisotropy metric you want to use. So that's actually a free choice, and you have to see what makes sense. Now we come over to a different topic, which is statistical tools. So until now we have looked at pixels as shapes in different ways. Now we are kind of decoupling the shapes a little bit and go into combinations of linear algebra and statistics. And usually you have a lot of dry examples when you do these courses, and it doesn't really look like it's applicable to something that you can use. But some of them will come very handy. One is principal component analysis, which is in a kind of a way similar to k-means, because we are not looking at positions at all. We are just trying to squeeze together information based on the statistics. In the principal component analysis, you're not really looking into distinct groups, but what we are looking for is to find a linear combination of all the incoming data that best explain the variance in the whole image system. There are a couple of different books on this topic. I found this review about recent development. Then you do a dig in the topic. But anyway, if you're interested in looking into more about principal component analysis, this would be a good read. So what we're doing when we compute the PCA is first to compute the covariance or correlation matrix from a set of images. Then from that, we do an eigenvalue or single value decomposition. And the output is a sequence of singular values, which measure the importance of each eigenvalue. And with that, we also get a set of eigenvectors, which can be used to transform the data, to turn it in different ways to make it more corresponding. So you have one image representing a specific feature in the data, next one another feature, and so on. And the thing is, each of these images will be orthogonal to each other. So they should be representing new information, each image. So let's take an example of spectroscopy. It's a 1D example where we have 3 different spectra. We have some kind of noise spectrum. Then we have some fat spectrum. You see there is a little bump here and some other bump here. Then we have a protein spectrum, which actually adds another one over here. So we have 3 different kinds of spectra. One when there is nothing, one when we have fat, and one for protein. And now we want to see, if we do a lot of measurements and we want to compare different or cluster these spectra in a way, we can check, do a check here to compute this. And that a first check would be just be scatter plot curve 1 to curve 2 and so on. If they are similar, they would probably go a little bit closer to the diagonal, but not for sure. There would probably still be a cloud. This is actually, I would say, a spectrum check between fat and, let's see, what is it now exactly? I think it's fat and protein. And you see, it's just a big spread. It doesn't help us very much. So instead, now we fit the data with the help of principal component analysis. And for that, we need, we say we want to do an analysis with 5 components. And then we fit it to the test data. And out comes very nicely from these eigenvector components, we get 3 different clusters, and each cluster corresponds to fat, protein, and nothing. So this is a step on the way to maybe do some smarter clustering afterwards. So this was a 1D example, and we can also see here that from the variance in this data, you can see that the first component represents a lot of information. Next one, a little bit less. And then the remaining ones, they essentially doesn't contribute at all to these eigenvectors. So they will not be considered. This is actually something that is used when you do a compression of the data to reduce data which has great redundancy. Then you can also use the principal component analysis. And in principle, what you would do is to cut all the information which has too low explained variance and reconstruct the data from those with the most information. It's quite efficient actually to reduce the data this way. Now to an example in material science. I got a request from one of you and that it's too much biology. And here is actually one example from material science. And what we want to do is to explore crystal textures in metals. And the principle of what we are doing is to use Bragg edge imaging. And it's based on Bragg refractions within crystalline structures. And each material has its specific pattern of reflections. And when the Bragg criterion is fulfilled, then we have a real strong edge in the spectrum. And this is something that is used very much in neutron imaging these days. And one example is we have here iron face-centered cubic crystals. And the spectrum of that would look something like this. You can see every time we have fulfilled the Bragg criterion, we get a big jump in the attenuation coefficient. Here I got some assembly of different materials. We have 2 different ions, and you can see that there is a very strong difference here between ion type 1 and ion type 2. And that's because they have different crystal structures. I think one is single crystal and the other ones is a powder, and that gives very different responses in this energy scan. Now we have some data. It's actually, if you want to try it out, it's I think 85 megabytes big, so it's a chunk. And looking at the average image, you can't see anything actually. And in this image, you have 6 pieces, and they're produced with additive manufacturing techniques. And the investigation was about finding if there are structural changes in these samples. Looking at the spectra in different regions of this image, you can see here, this is in the air. That would be the yellow region here. The blue here is within the samples, and the green is the spacer between the samples. So you see that you have clearly in air and in the spacer, you essentially don't have any information at all. But within the samples, you have these typical spectra. So to do this analysis of the data, which is actually 128 by 128 times 600, I think it's about 600 energy bins. It's a pretty big volume. Now we need to reshape it so we have just 1D arrays for each time bin. So this is the first step that I'm doing. Next step is to compute mean and standard deviation, because we want to normalize the data for each time bin. And that is done here. So we are subtracting the average and dividing by the standard deviation. And that's done. And now we can go on to the next one. We again run the PCA with 5 components and do the fitting. Was pretty quick. And then we can start looking at the data. First, we can see that there is a lot of explained variance in the first component, and the second component goes down to a few % only. And the third one is, sorry, even less. The components of this, the principal components of this data look pretty weird, not really like what you would expect. And if we inspect the component 1 and component 2, we see that there is some kind of triangular distribution. We could imagine that one of these is background and spacer, and this blob would correspond to the material, but it's still very hard to really identify something within it. So with some visualization tricks, we can actually improve this display. And the trick is that I let the alpha value, so the transparency of each of these dots, go down very much. And then we can see that there is clearly these 2 regions here. But within the big blob, we have actually 2 pieces. So it can be divided into 2 here, which is interesting. So that means within the material, we have 2 different types of crystalline constellations. And this can be used for qualitative visualization. When we use the 3 first principal components, then we can actually use them for color coding in RGB space and create a new image. So the white beam image is just the average of everything. You can't see much of differences within it. But when we do this PCA enhanced image, then you can see that there is some different structure at the edges of the materials, and in the middle there is another structure. So this is actually what's a first information that people wanted to see when they did this experiment. And this takes us to the deeper analysis of the sample. So what we can do now is maybe thinking about segmenting this image, and then we can use this, again, the two or three principal components, and do some k-means clustering, for example. This is something I thought could be a good task if you want to do this as a project in the class. If you're interested in this, please contact me, and then we can discuss that. Projects in general, I think I will present after Easter, and then we also have a little bit more material to play with. And the projects, again, they can be something I propose or Stefano propose, or it can also be something from your master project or your PhD project. So please come to me and discuss after Easter, or maybe also during the breaks before, if you like. And the last thing we can do with, one further thing we can do with the PCA is to identify the shape tensor. And then we try to extract more shape information with the help of the PCA. And what we are going to do is to identify the optimal rotation of the sample or the object. And now we compute, we have vectors with all the x coordinates, vectors with all the y coordinates, and vectors with all the z coordinates. And they create together a covariance matrix, which we decompose, so we get our eigenvalues. And these eigenvectors, they now actually correspond to a transform matrix, a rotation matrix that can rotate the object. So looking at this car image, it's actually on the head now, but doesn't matter for this purpose. The eigenvectors of these positions show us that the image has one dominant axis in this direction and one dominant axis in this direction. That means we can rotate the whole object in this way, and in that way we have aligned with the x-axis and the y-axis, we have an object that has the longest axis in this direction and the shortest axis in this direction. This angle here doesn't have to be 90 degrees. If the object is kind of skewed, it will not be perfect. So then you can just align it to the first principal component. So rotating it, you can see that it looks like this. And then it should be that we have the longest distance in this direction. So we can do a lot with the principal components. We can compute orientations, we can do reduced images, we can compact our feature space, and so on. So it's very useful tool. One thing you have to think about is, for example, if you looked at this PCA enhanced image, is it doesn't correspond to physics anymore. It shows that you have great variations in different locations, but these are usually not so easy to directly link to the physics of the measurement. But they can be very useful anyway, particularly if you go on with the segmentation. The principal components can also be used to describe an elliptical model. So with this shape tensor, you can actually describe an ellipsoid or a blottoid thing, because you have two dominant axes, and they can say that, okay, we can inscribe an ellipse within this area. So this is something you can also think about when you want to do your comparisons. Can be used as simple shape comparison that you have when you want to measure the sphericalness, how spherical an object is, this is another way of doing it instead of just computing the volume and compare it to the perfect sphere. So now I'm done for the first part. So we can compute the bounding box of the object, but maybe not so useful always. But it's still good. We can, well, the box itself is not useful because you have some cutouts around the object that you want to look at, which actually doesn't tell really what we have. So it can be less misleading. Also, the ellipse may not be the best. So we can do different things with it. We have to maybe look at the entire object anyway, but sometimes it's good to have these simplifications of the objects. So that was the end of the first part. Let's take some minutes break, and then I'll be back with you in 1/4 past, I say. So see you then.